So we've gone through an exciting day and a half, 2 days of a really spectacular conference. There's been a lot of information that has been generated. All four of you have been in for most of the discussion, and we're going to do a couple of things. We all listened intently to what Jason and Sunil had to say, and we're going to sort of process that in our discussion. We're also going to try and get a sense of, what we heard during the past couple of days, and particularly how it impacts on the various fields that are represented up on the stage. And we're going to try and engage you as much as possible in a back and forth conversation as well. So it's not going to be what I would refer to as the traditional panel session, which is a great relief to the people who are up on the stage, because they didn't really have to prepare other than being their regular brilliant selves. So that said, let's find out who they are. And Ryan, why don't we start with you?
Sure. I am Ryan Stubbs. I'm the research director at the National Assembly of State Arts Agencies. So we are a membership organization for the 50 state public arts agencies, as well as the 6 jurisdictions, providing knowledge services, research, and representing those state agencies in Washington as well.
And what does the research director do?
Oh man, well, we do all kinds of data collection, partially for the NEA and in partnership with the NEA to collect data on the different types of activities that state arts agencies do in terms of grant making, in terms of programs and services, also how they're funded and how they fit into the arts ecosystem.
So you're a wonk. Spelled the regular way.
Spelled some way.
Okay, yeah. Great. Caitlin, who are you?
Caitlin Strokosch. I'm the executive director of the Alliance of Artist Communities. We're an international association of artist residency programs. We're based here in Providence. We work with about 400 different organizations around the world that are providing artists of all disciplines, writers, visual artists, choreographers, composers, and increasingly the folks we've been talking about that are working cross-sector that are harder to define, that are providing these artists with time and space to create new work. And they're places that are really about incubating creative process. And in that work, we do a lot of research and best practices for the field of artist in residence programs, and then looking at how artist residencies sort of fit in within the broader ecosystem of support for artists.
Would you say that your constituents are mostly organizations or individual artists?
Primarily our constituents are the organizations themselves, though we also do a lot of advocacy work on behalf of individual artists in general.
Great. Heather, who are you?
Hi, I'm Heather Bryant. I'm the Associate for Research at the Cultural Data Project. In our department in research, we facilitate requests and provide data to our three constituents, our stakeholders. Number one, arts and cultural organizations. Second being the funders or grant makers that we work with. And then third being the research community and any advocates.
So, and you're in about a dozen states now?
We are in 13 states and DC at this point.
Great. And Ray, tell us about yourself.
Sure. Wuni Kisag Nitampag, that is to say, good day, friends, in the traditional Narragansett dialect. My name is Raymond Two Hawks Watson. I am the executive director of the Mount Hope Neighborhood Association, which is a community development / social service agency that basically services the Mount Hope community, which is about half a mile, maybe a mile from here. And I'm also an executive member of the Eastern Medicine Singers, which is a traditional Algonquin Eastern Woodland style Native American drum group. So I guess that's part of the reason I'm here today speaking.
So Ray, you've heard a lot in the past couple of days about creative placemaking, and you run a small community-based organization that's not primarily arts related.
No, not at all.
Can you tell me what you've heard during the past couple of days that may be reflected in the kind of stuff that you're doing?
Sure. Well, first of all, that I've actually been doing placemaking through art. That was not at all what I had in mind when we started doing what we were doing at Mount Hope. I just knew 2 very important things to the work that I was doing. That art has the power to bring people together, and art has the power to change perception. So being that Mount Hope is a neighborhood that kind of has a negative reputation about it, we've got our issues with violence, drug dealing, things of that nature, but not all the time. I knew that if we could somehow get people coming to the neighborhood or to the center, they would see that that wasn't really what the neighborhood was all about. So through a small business incubator program, we started there. We've been hosting a small art gallery, and it's really been doing an excellent, excellent job of getting people from different walks of life to actually come through the doors of the center, which is beneficial to getting the word out about other services and programs that we offer.
Heather, are you getting requests from around the country for, now that, just to put this in context, and all those people who are here from Rhode Island certainly know the Cultural Data Project and the vast amount of information that you ask for as part of this process. Are you getting requests from around the country for information that helps with the kind of research that you've heard described in the past couple of days?
Not on the scale that's been here. Most of what we do is, we do a lot of advocacy-based work. So we work with state agencies. In Arizona, in Michigan, in Rhode Island, in Vermont now, to provide data on what's happening within the state. So it's people who are receiving money from the public agencies within the states. And just to clarify, the Cultural Data Project, most of the organizations that we have data on are submitting for applications for either public or private funding.
Right.
So most of what we're doing is advocacy-based, a lot of scope and size, a little bit of the indicators as to how the nonprofit sector is doing within those states, but not necessarily on the creative placemaking level. And I think that's something that we as an organization are trying to figure out how we can help and be a piece of that puzzle and what we can do to better serve that cause.
Okay. Now, Ryan, you're actually collecting information that are submitted by the state arts agencies to the National Endowment for the Arts and sort of processing a lot of that information. Are you also struggling with the question about creative placemaking and how that information supplements that kind of discussion?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, I think that's an interesting question to see, to talk about how indicators relevant to creative placemaking would match up with some of the other data collection efforts that states are already doing. But I think a lot of states are engaging in this work and have been doing it for quite some time. As Jason mentioned, the Adams Arts program in Massachusetts was a forerunner to our town. A lot of states have community development coordinators on staff and run community development programs and grants where, you know, that this is what they're doing, and something that they have been doing for a long time is investments in community and investments in place. Now, figuring out how to measure those things, I think, is something where we're trying, where there needs to be some more work. And so I think some of the conversation that we've had at this conference, the work that the NEA is doing around indicators, and other folks have been doing around indicators for a while, all of that work will contribute to what state arts agencies can collect.
And is that conversation going on now to maybe collect different kinds of information or things that could make this sort of understanding the impact of creative placemaking more available?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, I think one initiative coming out from the endowment is to more closely link the, and sorry, Sunil, correct me if I'm wrong here, but more closely link the data collection that's done on the direct grantee level with the data collection that's done on the state level. So there's, you know, possibly some cross-pollination there, but I think states are also looking at this issue from their local perspective and what data they can collect that speak directly to more local projects. For example, cultural districts, where many more states are starting to engage in these types of policies, where there's a geographic location and a formal policy set in place by the state. And so with those policies, we're going to want to see some outcomes. So states are starting to do more evaluation on what kinds of economic indicators and others they can talk about related to those place-based policies.
I'm interested in coming back to that actually and sort of exploring what you're discovering as indicators beyond the traditional stuff.
Sure.
Caitlin, the communities that you're working with are very much embedded in community life. And I'm wondering how they've been approaching this whole concept of creative placemaking.
Yeah, that's a great question. I think one of the things that came up in Jason's talk earlier that I thought was very interesting is that the Our Town grants are showing that a lot of this creative placemaking is happening not just in urban areas, but the rise of this kind of activity in small towns and in rural areas as well. 60% of the organizations that we work with are in small towns and rural areas, so I think there's a real shift in thinking about the kind of creative activity that can happen in a different kind of community, whereas the dialogue, I think, previously was often about what happens in urban centers. So the folks that we've seen in these smaller towns and rural areas, like Worm Farm, which is one of the organizations that we work with, that Jason was talking about, have these connections often with partners that are not just in the arts. So in the larger urban centers, a lot of the organizations that we see, their partners are typically also within the arts sector. So they're looking at partnering with museums, with art schools, with other cultural facilities where there's sort of an obvious connection and synergy. Because you don't always have that kind of cultural infrastructure in a smaller town or a rural community, those arts organizations are reaching out to their food co-ops, to their farmers markets, to other kinds of partners that you wouldn't necessarily expect. And so I think that has created some really interesting opportunities for the sort of synergy that we've been seeing in creative placemaking that doesn't just keep it within the cultural sector.
Do you find that your constituents, I know you just came back from your annual conference, was this a topic of conversation? Was this something that they're thinking about with a certain degree of intentionality?
Yeah, I mean, traditionally artist residencies were thought of as these kind of artist colonies out in the woods, these ivory towers where artists go and they work in isolation and there's really intentionally away from the public. And there's been a real shift in the last couple of decades about both the role of that organization within their community and also the opportunity for artists coming into a new community for a month or 2 months or 6 months or a year or whatever. And so there's a lot of conversation now about looking beyond just having an artist go teach a workshop in a school or do some of those kinds of one-off engagement activities, but really looking at sort of deeper, meaningful engagement with artists that are coming into a community for a temporary period of time. And then I think the rise of artist social practice has played a really big role in our field, with artist residencies having to respond to how a residency program can support an artist with a social practice when they're really set up to be completely the opposite and remove artists from that kind of social life.
And Ray, you're working in a pretty urban environment and with an organization that really doesn't have necessarily an arts and cultural mission or focus. As you've started to introduce art and cultural kinds of things into Mount Hope Neighborhood Association, have you found that people are connecting with you in different ways? Are you finding that you're reaching other kinds of people?
Absolutely. One example I'd like to give, we've been coordinating for the past 4 years, actually with the assistance of RISCA, the New England Native American Culture Week and Big Drum Powwow. My board vice chair, he's very business-minded. So when he came on board, he was like, we're going to do a reevaluation of all the programs and services that we have here. And I was very big on the native cultural stuff. And he told me in the initial conversation, we're going to find a place for this, but I'm not quite sure where it goes yet. So this past New England Native American Culture Week, we hosted the Native Art exhibit at our gallery. And he came up to me after and said, I get it now. Because he had been standing outside and we were inside drumming. And he said a couple was walking down the street. He'd never seen them in the neighborhood before. And they were getting ready to walk by. And all of a sudden they heard the drumming. And he saw them stop, look at each other, peek into the door to see what was going on, look at each other, give each other the affirmation, and walk in. Why you've been doing it, because people will come. They might not come to learn about, police abuse that's going on in the neighborhood. They might not come to talk about the issues we're having with keeping our youth engaged in education and things of that nature. But they might come to hear the drum group play. They might come to see the art. And if we can get them to do that, then we feel like our services are quality enough that they might be interested in learning a little bit more or getting more engaged in the agency outside of that. So I'd have to say absolutely. And once again, I did not know that I was doing placemaking. I just knew that art could bring people together and change perception. So.
And now you have a name for it.
Absolutely.
Great. Heather, how long has the Cultural Data Project been around?
Ooh, it started, so went live, I'll say, in 2004. There was a lot of work done before that, but it went live in Pennsylvania in 2004.
Okay, and it's fair to say that when this came live, when it was available for all, you had a set of data that you were trying to sort of gather over time. And now we're seeing, I think it's fair to say, some changes in the way the field both practices its work and perhaps evaluates its work. How does an organization like yours sort of cope with that kind of a change?
Well, we have made very slight changes in the past, 9 years, to accommodate a broader version of what arts and culture means, to bring on a lot of the humanities organizations, altering some of the line items within the data profile. But especially now, we're in a strategic planning process. For those of you who don't know, we used to be under, or just a project within the Pew Charitable Trust in Philadelphia. Now we are our own 501c3 as of April. So we're going through this entire strategic planning process. And part of that process is to now look at the data we collect, ask the field and ourselves, is this the data that people need? So we'll need a lot of feedback from different disciplines, different functional groupings of organizations to tell us, like, these are the things that we are valuing, so that we can then think about how can we best capture what every individual organization wants to see.
But you also have to balance that with the fact that you want a look at certain kinds of information over time.
And yes, and we talked a lot about that, and one of the things that's come out is, with any data set, there has to be some standardization. If we can work with all of the snowflakes on the input side and allow people to vary in programming and expense categories and revenue, and then take that data and standardize it more so on the backside, that will allow us to get the broader data set that we'll be able to use for research.
I'm sorry, is snowflakes a technical term? Oh, okay.
It's our own term of endearment.
Okay, well, there you go. Ryan, you must get a lot of pressure to add information that should be gathered from state arts agencies, probably on a daily basis.
Pressure from state arts agencies?
No, pressures from the field or from
Sure.
other factors out there who want you to gather this or that beyond what is already being gathered.
Yeah, it's a good question. I mean, there's a vast amount of things that we could measure, and being able to, to Heather's point, that standardization is key in being able to have some longitudinal data points that are comparable as well. So, I think that there's much more data that's out there that's available at the local project level, and to speak to the conversation about evaluation, there's all kinds of things, there's activities that people in working in arts projects and arts organizations are undergoing every day, and all of those are data points, and those are things that we could collect and could measure. Just to that point, I think there's all kinds of things that we could measure and that we may want to, and so we have to think strategically about that when we're looking at it from a national perspective.
Are you hearing any things that are directly related to the topics we've been discussing over the past couple of days? The kinds of things that maybe aren't being collected now, but that people want to see collected?
Sure. Well, I mean, we always get into the conversation about jobs, right? And so at least from the data collection that we do related to state arts agencies, which is a very specific type of grants data that we're looking at, we might not be able to measure those the jobs in a way that are going to be directly relevant to like a full-time employment position or something of that nature, economic data that can be important to policy making. But there's other ways of getting at that information.
This is the question that Ryan and Heather don't want me to ask, but is there anything that any of you out there have really wanted to see sort of studied or collected or gathered that would help you make your case a little better? Anything you've dreamed that a researcher might actually look at as far as creative placemaking?
Hi, my name is Renate. I'm from University of Maryland. I'm curious to know if there's what kind of research has been done at looking at the relationship, particularly on temporary projects, either art, design, performance, that have focused on sites that are in transition, and how those kind of works can or have stimulated conversation with the public about the future of those places.
Anyone can take just a stab at that.
Sure. So
Ryan,
I actually may not have a specific example for you, but you're looking at, are you talking about the sustainability of particular projects?
Well, I think there's a whole range of issues. One is ability to bring in kind of stakeholders to the table in different ways. Two, in making perhaps other kinds of character or histories or things visible to people that then brings those issues to the table in a way. Perhaps changes the planning of those spaces.
So those aren't really data points, but they're more sort of anecdotal.
But I'd like them to be data points.
Oh, okay. Is it possible to make something like that a data point?
I
Caitlin?
can maybe offer an example of because so much of the work that we do is about temporary engagements and about things happening over a month or a few months at a time. McCall Center for Visual Art in Charlotte has a wonderful artist in residence program where they have about a dozen artists in residence at a time for about 4 months at a time. And they've always had a real interest in revitalizing the uptown neighborhood in Charlotte and creating this kind of cultural corridor. They're at one end of a kind of anchor end of this cultural corridor in downtown Charlotte. And some of the challenges that they found, they were doing a lot of evaluation of their programs in their first decade, and some of the problems that they found were that engaging a new set of partners every time they had a new artist in residence was really challenging. Maintaining those relationships with partners in the community was difficult when they had set up an expectation that they were going to be engaged, and then that artist was gone in 4 months, and then those relationships weren't sustained. So in some ways you were taking a step forward and then 2 steps back, because then your partners are upset that you're no longer talking to them. So this is some of the evaluative stuff that they were figuring out. One of the solutions that they have come up with, which I think is fairly unique in our field, is that they have identified what they call their spheres of influence, and they've decided they're going to work with a consistent set of partners in their community, and they're going to ask artists to come and engage in projects that will specifically work within that structured set. So the organization is taking a stronger role in maintaining those relationships over time, but you still have the advantage of artists coming in and doing temporary engagements, working with partners and working with a community for a couple of months at a time, and then leaving. And then so there's this constant influx of new ideas, new people, and new projects. But there's a consistent kind of foundation that's happening there that has shown that those partners are now more engaged over time, that there's been greater traction in terms of the kinds of ways that they want to change and impact that community, and the sort of aggregate effect is much higher now that they have created this kind of consistent structure that works with the inconsistent other factors that they have.
So then the measurements of the relationships with the existing organizations and their effectiveness and perhaps a change of their vision or strategies for redeveloping or revitalizing the area, their way of working with artists.
Right, and those the partner organizations can look at the kind of effect that it's had on their ability to be successful to meet their goals over a longer period of time, because now there's more of a consistent track record of working together, even though the individual projects vary every 3 or 4 months.
Yes, my name's Kimberly Dragons, and I'm from Washington, D.C. It's actually in response to the question that you just raised. One area to look at is the whole tactical urbanism movement, and Mike Lydon in particular has done a lot of work around that. So I would definitely say, in terms of if you're looking for metrics, Mike Lydon, tactical urbanism, guerrilla urbanism, that's a definitely a very sort of temporary project defined in a very sort of particular way, but it might give you some direction. Also, we can talk offline, because our office and the temporary projects that we've been engaged in, we've had a set of metrics to measure our success as well. So I'll talk to you offline.
Do you think those are metrics that are specific to the work that you do or can be transferable to others?
I think that there's definitely some transfer. Some of it can be transferred. A lot of it is based on some of our small area planning work that we do and using some of the metrics that we have in our plans, but some of it was also around the Art Place grant. So we did sort of a mashup of some of our citywide goals that we were trying to achieve through our neighborhood planning, as well as some of the metrics that we were looking to, and these weren't metrics that Art Place imposed on us. These were ones that we developed when we were looking at writing the proposal on how we would evaluate, success or not. So it's actually one. Well, some of them have been discussed. Like we had a lot of it was about media outreach and campaigns, so social media. So we required all of our sub-grantees to have a Facebook and Twitter account to kind of get the word out. We also looked at vacancy rates, because our stuff was around activating vacant and underutilized space. So we looked at vacancy before and a year after the project and see what was leased up and what wasn't. We also looked at new businesses that opened up after the events occurred. And these are not necessarily always creative businesses, but they support the creative economy. So restaurants in a neighborhood. We also looked at the timing of some of those lease-ups. Like if we activated a space temporarily, we looked at when that space was leased up and could maybe draw some causality if our project had some type of influence on the space being leased up. So we did some debrief interviews with the people that came into the space and asked them questions about kind of what attracted you to the neighborhood, without saying, was it the Art Place project, but, they would cite that. We looked at things like where we were cited in blogs as a way to kind of measure our community engagement. And our office led also some community meetings as well to kind of take the temperature with residents around how they were feeling around the engagement. So those are just a few.
Great. Super. Yes.
Ann Gadwa Nicodemus, Metros Arts Consulting. So I wanted to bring the conversation back a little bit to Randall's opening, where he presented what I think he framed as creative placemaking stats for Rhode Island.
Just cultural.
Okay. So yeah, I guess I want to just push on this, since we're talking about metrics, and Heather from the CDP is here. So, part of the points I raised were, is the data relevant? Is it accurate in the opening keynote on Thursday? So when we're looking at, I believe most of those were from the CDP, the metrics. So the research that I've used the CDP for on the state of California, we found that small arts organizations, nonprofits, were really underrepresented, and we had to do all this benchmarking to IRS data to try to make it representative for the state overall. And so one of the things to think about is the sample representative of your universe? So if you're defining your universe as just your pool of grantees, you're golden, right? Because those are the people that do the CDP. But if you're actually trying to talk about the state overall, which your slides were framed that way, it's important to sort of have disclosures and caveats and So I guess that was a point I wanted to make. And then just Heather, if you wanted to speak with the whole sort of strategic planning process, if there's any ways in which the organization has been trying to adjust to some of these challenges and opportunities with it as a data source.
Oh, certainly. Thank you. So we are working on a technological platform that is 10 years old. We have heard far and wide that is the first thing that has to change. We do think that changing the technology will be incredibly helpful in decreasing the barriers to participation in CDP, but the biggest thing after that are what are the tools that we can provide that will bring more arts and cultural organizations into the fold. And the biggest group that we don't want to let sight of are the smaller organizations. They are the ones who need the tools, they're the ones who need the capacity, and anything that we can do to help is something that we're certainly looking into. But it's also a matter of how do we make ourselves an internal part of people's process. And for those of you who do not participate in CDP, we collect historic data. So it's only closed book data. It's audits, financial reviews. That's what we have. It's not live. So that's another hurdle that we see for ourselves is how do we become more relevant and then make our data more relevant to organizations on an individual level, and then to grant makers, and then to the broader research community.
And Ann, thank you for your comments. I thought I had made it clear that the information that I was providing came from the CDP, and it was here in Rhode Island that our organizations that apply to the State Arts Council, the Council for the Humanities, and the Rhode Island Foundation are all included in that.
Yeah, and it's an opportunity too, because for advocacy you can say these are conservative estimates because we know it's not catching anything. So if you're using this to try to, for advocacy purposes, you can even use that to your advantage.
I work in state government, so I'm by de facto a conservative.
Randy, can I just say one more thing before we move on? So within the Cultural Data Project, we collect nonprofit arts and cultural organizations or programs that are arts and culturally based within larger 501c3s. So I'm not sure that we will be able to get to a place where we're capturing the smallest of organizations if they're not in that universe.
Alex from Vermont again. Sorry about this, but the National Endowment for the Arts' 50th birthday is coming up next year, in 2015. And I think that that's a great opportunity in the context of this conversation to issue a challenge to ourselves. Creative placemaking has been called many, many things over the years. When I first got into the field, we were talking about it in terms of the creative economy, cultural heritage tourism was a big piece of sort of going to a place because it is arts or culture based and it had all sorts of additional things going for it. And then the discussion turned to the creative economy, and now we're talking about creative placemaking, and it's a wonderful evolution as our field has matured. And we're all talking about things that we intuitively understand and can literally feel when we are in the presence of a place that is a creative place. And it is a subjective feeling that we get, and we know it when we see it, but we're having a hard time defining it, and we're certainly having a hard time measuring it. And I'm wondering if we don't cast as a birthday present to the National Endowment for the Arts, because it ultimately, in my opinion, comes down to making sure that Congress supports the NEA, because the NEA is the source from which so many other things have flowed over the past half century in terms of supporting all of our work collectively, creating the matching requirements. So as a gift back to the NEA, I would like to suggest that some of the people in this room who are evaluators or are from universities take a look at the acknowledged creative places in their own home states and come up with some basic rubric that they can analyze what makes that place a creative place. How long did it take? Who were the leaders that were involved? What kind of personalities did they have? How much money did it take? From what sources? do a full court press on what we know are creative places. Instead of trying to invent some out of whole cloth, we got hundreds of them everywhere. So let's look at them, learn about them, and then say, this is what we have done over the last 50 years. And if you don't believe it, you're a moron. And I think a lot of people need to be told that they're idiots if they don't understand intuitively what we all get here. Am I right? I'd love to give that birthday present to the NEA because they deserve it, they deserve our support, and the advocates have to step it up. And it's not so much about the data, it's about the passion that you speak about what we do that really sells it. I went, Grant Makers in the Arts a couple of weeks ago, somebody said, all this talk about, economic development, nobody bought an opera ticket because they wanted to increase the amount of money going into state coffers through the gasoline tax that they paid when they filled their car up. That's not why you go to the opera. You go to the opera because you gotta go to the opera. The gas and all that other stuff is incidental. So we have to go back and look at what makes a community creative to begin with. Really get comfortable, and there are many, many different kinds. And then say, okay, that's what we're talking about.
Okay, great. Thank you, Alex. We've only got a few minutes left, and I think the best way to use that time is, see, he says 2 minutes, is I'm just going to ask each of the panelists for a takeaway. You've been here for a couple days, you've heard the discussions, you've taken in all of the ideas and energy related to creative placemaking. What's it going to mean in Mount Hope, Ray?
What's it going to mean in Mount Hope? It means that we're going to step up our efforts even greater. I'm happy to hear that it's not all just about the numbers, because in the community, when you're trying to, you need numbers, you need this, you need that. In Mount Hope, we're a small community, but the impact that we're having is tremendous. So I'm very encouraged that the qualitative aspect of it, the passionate side, the lives that are changing, the perceptions that are being open, the minds broadened, that those are still important factors in determining who's going to be supported.
Okay. Heather, knowing that you can't make major changes overnight in an agency like yours, are there things that you've heard here that you'll bring to the table when you sit down to talk about the future of the Cultural Data Project?
Certainly. I think to take off of what Ray just said, one of the things that we've started picking up and rolling with, and that we need to do above and beyond what we are doing, is this idea of data plus stories equals impact. Data plus stories equals impact. So you can have all the data you want, but if you don't tell the story about, little Susie down the street, no one cares. But also, if you can have the stories, but if you don't have anything to back it up, there are constituents who are going to say, that doesn't matter to us, right? So to combine the two is something that we think at our organization is incredibly powerful. And of course, we think data is powerful. It's in our name, right? So that's certainly one of the things I think we can take back.
Great. Caitlin, you're one of the best communicators I know. So when you write about this gathering to your field, basically, what are the kinds of things that you're going to suggest to them or say to them?
When I started with this organization 11 years ago, the Rise of the Creative class that was what was on everybody's tongue, and there was so much focus on economic development through the arts and cultural economy and cultural tourism, and for the majority of our constituents that are very small organizations, they never felt like they had a voice because they couldn't demonstrate that kind of large economic impact. And what I find incredibly exciting about the creative placemaking movement is that there is a place for all of us. There's an entry point for all of us. There is incredible impact to be had on a small scale, small organizations, individual efforts, lots of little kind of activities and engagements that are happening that allow everybody to have a place in this.
Great. And Ryan, the National Endowment for the Arts is clearly focused on this topic. And you are one of the research gurus that help them tell the story that they need to tell. Is there anything that you're going to take from this that you will bring to the table in these discussions with Sunil?
Sure. Well, I think that there's a lot of takeaways from this conference and from a cultural policy perspective. I think one of the things that this conference has made me think about is that creative placemaking or community building has always been something very integral to the value of the arts. And as we're able to create the evaluations that, and I also think something that came away is that the importance of being able to evaluate on the specific program level can really teach us a lot about how efforts towards creative placemaking have worked in particular communities, and that kind of local information is so valuable to the conversation. But also I think when we get into a conversation about the arts and something else, the arts and economic development, the arts and creative placemaking, the arts and education, all of these things are really important to being able to demonstrate the social outcomes or the economic outcomes of the arts that are important to policymakers. But I think, just going back to what I think was important about this conference, is that the tie-in to how arts are integral within our communities was very apparent.
So, with thanks to Barnaby Evans and to Peter Mello for putting together a terrific conference, to Sunil and Jason for their terrific presentation, and to our 4 panelists, thus endeth DataFest 2013.